I live in a very rural area on a small ranch that has been with my family since my grandfather. We are about 15 minutes from the nearest small town. When I say small, I really mean small. I met my wife by chance about 6 years ago when I stopped in town to pick up some groceries. She gave off a very tomboy vibe and she just came to the area herself. She had just finished school and found that she hated city life and wanted to come back to something more familiar. I'll get to that later. I guess she saw me pull in with my pickup and some of the heavier equipment in it, and she came over and asked what sort of livestock I had. She quickly cut to the chase. She was looking for work, she had experience with livestock, and she was new to the area. It is strange in our area to have single women looking for work as a ranch hand, but she said she could prove her worth, and, if I wasn't impressed, I was free to drive her back to town at the bus stop, and that'd be that. I was looking for an extra hand for the upcoming months and was considering contacting my neighbor's boys for it, but figured I'd give her a shot. Glad I did too. She has one hell of a work ethic, and was proactive about everything on the ranch. I let her stay in a guest room in the main house for the first week, until she had enough pay for an apartment, but within 6 months she moved back in when we started dating. 8 months later was when we married in a small ceremony with about 20 friends and family members. The only person to show up from her family was her uncle. Uncle was a tank of man, even in his older years, and had a sheep farm in Northern California. Him and I talked shop a bit when he was there, and he was proud to give wife away. I could see where wife got her work ethic and knowledge of livestock from the man. There was, however, one topic that wife did not like to discuss. It was her birth parents. At first, all she would say was there was bad blood between them. Early on, that was fine. We didn't know each other yet. But after the engagement, I wanted to know more about her, and know what exactly I was diving into. Her mother, the professor, worked in a college teaching a class I most likely would never attend. Her father, Phil, was, as wife described, a weak man that does what the professor demands. Some of the things wife described the professor in doing sounded absurd and borderline insane. It included her trying to get wife a girlfriend in middle school, insisting wife was a lesbian. Now, wife is a bit of a tomboy, there's no denying that, but she is also most definitely not a lesbian. There was a period where the professor wanted to live a natural lifestyle, and she asked Phil's brother to let them live on his farm. Within a week, the professor hated the farm and dragged them both back to the city. Wife, on the other hand, felt like she finally found something she liked and really connected with her uncle. Wife left home when she was 16 and lived with uncle until she was 18. All while she was with uncle, the professor kept threatening to drag her back. She never did. After wife turned 18, she went to school and received a 4-year degree and tried to work an office job, but found it unfulfilling. She started to take the bus and working odd jobs in rural areas, looking for something that fit what she was looking for. That was when our paths crossed. Last year, around March, we started getting mail addressed to the professor and fill bills and bank statements and such. I found this strange, and wife wanted to trash it. I started marking them return to sender and no such occupant and dropped them right back into the mailbox. This came to a head in October when I was cleaning up the yard and a bright white SUV drove up with a U-Haul attached to it. Wife looked up and turned pale. "Oh God, it's them," she said. Out stepped a rotund woman and a thin man that only had a passingly resemblance to uncle. The professor immediately walked up to wife. "Professor, well, let me have it look at you. It's been years." Wife, "Mom. What are you doing here?" "Professor, the university is doing virtual classes, and with COVID, we figured we can self-isolate at our ranch." The R had a weird emphasis. "Me, excuse me, but this isn't your ranch." "Professor, oh, I'm sure we can have the ownership all cleared up." "Well, aren't you going to invite us in?" "Me, ma'am, you may be my wife's mother, but you are a stranger to me. I would rather not." The professor turned to Phil. "Professor, make the call." Phil instantly got on the phone with the police and started spinning a tale about us not letting them into the house that they equally own with us. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and how insane it was being spun. Luckily, as I said before, small town. The sheriff pulled up, and it was someone I knew for most of my life. Sheriff really embodies the mindset of a small town constable. He tries to be a peacemaker and a peacekeeper first and foremost. He also knew that this land was in my family's name for 3 generations. "Sheriff, what's this I hear about you selling half your ranch, Duke?" "Me, I didn't. These are my wife's parents and they think they have a legal stake on my land." "Professor, not think, no. We've lived here since February. With tenant laws, that means." "Sheriff, funny, I don't remember you in town." That shut the professor right up for a second, but then she reached in her bag and pulled out a stack of letters. A lot of them the bills and bank statements, with the ranch's address. "Professor, then how do you explain these?" Sheriff took the letters and looked at them. "Sheriff, ma'am, these are all marked return to sender." The professor turned desperate. "Professor, please. I haven't seen my daughter in years. I just want to make sure she's okay. Surely you can see that she pointed, to me, is controlling her every move." Sheriff rolled his eyes and walked over to talk to wife and I again. Sheriff likes to solve problems between people. And he hasn't encountered this level of crazy before. Sheriff, you might just want to invite them in for coffee. Talk for a few minutes. Wife, they are your parents. Wife, if you leave them here, you will just have to come back in 5 minutes to handle an assault. Sheriff, wife, you can't mean that. They're your family. Look, I'm just going to head up the road. Invite them in, talk to them. Wife got a bit of an angry glint in her eye. Wife, does this mean you're going to invite your cousin Aaron to Thanksgiving? Sheriff's cousin Aaron was currently serving 8 years for a multitude of felonies. Sheriff's entire family consider him the family's shame. With that statement, the look in Sheriff's eyes changed. He gave wife a look like that bad, huh? And wife merely nodded. Sheriff turned back to the professor and Phil. Sheriff, all right, they don't want you here. Best you two not come back. The two protested briefly, but then piled back into the SUV and drove off, with Sheriff trailing right behind to make sure they were completely off the property. This was the first time I met the professor and Phil, but it definitely stuck with me. I detailed earlier about how my wife's mother, the professor, tried a strange attempt to seize control of our ranch back in October. In December, it got crazier. Keep in mind we live in a smaller town. About an hour away from a major city, so it's not like we are totally in the boondocks. Our ranch is about 15 minutes from town by Farm Road, just to give you a lay of the land. I stopped into town to get some supplies, and by the time I was done packing up the truck, the professor tapped me on the shoulder. This time she actually acted cordial. I chose to be curt. She basically begged me to at least listen to her for 5 minutes in the local cafe. I didn't want her to create a scene on Main Street, so I agreed. We sat and the professor talked. She claimed my wife was always confused about who she was, and that the professor and Phil had only her best interests in mind. I didn't want to yell, shout, accuse, or throw anything back in her face. I was just waiting out the clock. She said my wife saw you coming and wedged herself into my life. At that I did push back at. I said that I felt I was blessed to have her in my life. Hoo boy, those were the wrong words to use with this woman. Professor, what do you mean blessed? Dukes, pardon? Professor, you just said blessed. I put my head in my hands and just wished this was over, everyone in the cafe looking at the two of us. The professor really projected her voice with the last sentence. Dukes, ma'am, if you're trying to win me over, I suggest you stop using vinegar. She sort of humped at that statement. But she did become cordial again. She dug into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. She placed it on the table in between us. Professor, fine. This is all the proof you need. Take a look, and I promise you will know the truth. I was dying on the inside from embarrassment from how my mother-in-law acted, with people I do business with regularly all watching. They will want to know what happened, and why. Like I said before, small town. I took the flash drive and left. I got back to the ranch where my wife was waiting, and she could instantly tell something happened in town from the pissed off look on my face. I explained what happened in town and held up the flash drive. Wife looked confused by it. I certainly wasn't willing to plug this thing into a computer we regularly use, so I dug through a closet for an old Dell laptop that wasn't powered on in forever. We let it charge, turned it on and flipped off the Wi-Fi. The last one was my wife's idea. We plugged the flash drive in and there were stacks and stacks of PDFs. I am still not sure how to describe what was in them. It was I guess, journal. A college paper? Thesis? Study? With my wife as the subject. I'm not even sure what the point of it was, or what the professor was testing on her own flesh and blood. It detailed her first playing with toy dump trucks when she was a child to dressing in overalls during the brief time they lived with her uncle together. All if it cold, detached, and, as my wife put it, clinical. Wife was referred to as subject throughout. It was bizarre. And I'm still not sure what the point of it was. My wife looked disgusted at the PDFs and insisted we burn the drive. Which we did in the fire pit. That was the last time we heard from the professor. My wife thinks more is coming. First I want to say wife is doing fine. She's more amused than scared or angry, but I can tell when she feels a need to be guarded. We did install a new camera pointed directly down at the gate and I'm keeping it locked. I said in the comments we had a FaceTime call with my wife's uncle to see if we could get more insight last night. At first, her uncle gave very short answers. Stuff like yeah, sounds like her and sounds about right. He's very much a don't speak ill of others type of man. When I told him about the weird play for the ranch, he finally was willing to give a bit more information. Whoever predicted she attempted this in the past with his sheep farm? Gold star. He said the professor was a big reason why him and Phil don't talk anymore. Wife's uncle's sheep farm was part of a much larger piece of land owned by my wife's grandfather. The grandfather had 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter went off to the East Coast and works a high-paying executive job of some type. She's also near retiring, and was the oldest of the siblings. The grandfather split his property into 3 slices when he died. His daughter sold her part to uncle for almost nothing. She didn't want rural property nor has she made a claim for it, and knew uncle wanted to keep the farm going. The other son, or my Phil, sort of kept ownership but gave permission for uncle to keep using it. That was until he wanted to go to an expensive university. He sold his part of the land to uncle for a good chunk of change. Uncle got to keep all of grandfather's land in one piece. In college, Phil dated the professor, and then married. Uncle heard bits and pieces, but Phil just only called during Thanksgiving and his birthday, and that was about it for many years. A few years later, professor was in, as the uncle called it, a hipster phase and heard about the farm. She didn't just show up. Phil asked first. Phil knew what rural life was like, professor didn't. Uncle described it as the professor had a vision of waking up to a kale smoothie, digging up beets for lunch and enjoying the sun the rest of the day. If you live on a farm or a ranch, you're spoiled for choice when it comes to daily chores. Uncle's farm was primarily a sheep farm, but they had a vegetable garden and a small orchard. This meant work. Uncle was easy on the professor. She was only given a few chores, such as clipping dead vines in the garden and airing the compost. She apparently treated this like an ordeal. She nearly destroyed the tomatoes Uncle was growing that year, and he had to redo the compost every evening. But the way she complained, you'd think she was tending the orchard and the sheep. She did not like manual labor. But she was also oddly in love with the idea of a farm. You can't have the joy without the pain, in my experience. Wife, on the other hand, took to it like a duck to water. She loved to check the fences, check the flock, dole out the feed, and tend to the small vegetable garden. Uncle said that they had a local butcher that came once in a while for a few lambs, depending on price and demand. Butcher visited once during the professor's time on the farm. Butcher was a black man, which Uncle didn't mind or care. Professor cared. She made a big show of greeting him, shaking his hand, and came to him in a very sing-songy, high-pitched way. Uncle found this very strange. At least strange enough to mention to us. Professor wanted the farm, but didn't want to work it. She wanted to own it on paper and have the uncle and her husband work it. She went as far as to push her husband to contest the sale he had with Uncle a few years back to gain a partial ownership. This went nowhere, of course. Uncle did have to hire a lawyer, but it didn't even make it to court. Him and the rest of the family refused to talk to Phil after that. I was curious, so I had to know why the professor blew up at me when I said I was blessed to have wife. He chuckled a bit. Really kicked that hornet's nest, huh? He said. First night the professor was staying with Uncle and his wife prepared dinner. They got to the table and Uncle was about to say grace. My wife blushed when he brought this up. Apparently this is a very embarrassing memory for her. Professor blew up. She said something about how this family doesn't say grace. Uncle shrugged. He wanted to be accommodating and responded that she didn't have to join if she didn't want to. She tried to push it further. As long as she was in that house, there would be no saying grace. Uncle said this was the first time he was rude to the professor. He told her that there was no way a guest was telling him what he could and couldn't do in his own home. Apparently the professor didn't think people in rural areas go to church or something? I don't know. After hearing about the sheep farm, I will get in touch with a lawyer. We'll see how that goes. I think I've said it before in an earlier post, but we live in a small town. My crazy mill, the professor, has made waves in just 2 appearances, one at our residence, and another in town. What I love about small towns is that everyone feels like family and has everyone's backs. What I hate about small towns is that rumors start quickly. The sheriff from my first post is totally on her side and has done his best to make it clear to people who ask that it's not their business. The problem is wife and we try to enjoy being social in town. Before COVID, we went to church often and participated in potlucks. I hired my neighbor's boys for the summer several times to help around the ranch. We love being social. When the professor made a scene at the cafe in December, I could feel the eyes of the town on me. No one knows what happened, but they want to. I can feel it. They are too polite to ask, but not polite enough to not whisper. It's getting to us. The sheriff told me that last week the local pastor outright asked him what was going on with wife and her mother. Sheriff said the pastor felt there should be an easy solution. Sheriff nipped that into bud. My wife's words had a stronger effect than we thought. Sheriff said it wasn't his business or the pastor's unless we asked for help. He did say to the pastor, and I'm remembering how the sheriff phrased it to me when he told me, they're part of your flock. She, the professor, is the wolf. Be a good shepherd. Even with that, I still feel the weird glances every time I'm in town. Scenes like the one in December isn't usual around here. Any advice? Well, it finally happened. The professor and Phil are in jail. The circumstances are a bit strange as well, but we are glad there's a conclusion at least. 2 nights ago, the sheriff called us in the middle of the day. My wife picked up and after a few minutes of chatting she started laughing. She told me what the sheriff told her. It seems the professor and Phil decided they wanted to try to sneak onto our land. Why? Geez, I can't predict this woman. The professor decided that instead of trying to get onto the ranch from the farm road, which we have clear view of from the house, that her and Phil decided to park a little ways away, and try to get onto our land via a neighbor's property. My neighbor to the east has a small orchard and is a hobby beekeeper. He doesn't get a lot of honey a year and what he does he shares or sells at the farmer's market. Field chickweed just started to flow here, so the bees were out. The professor apparently stumbled onto his bee boxes, and I mean literally bumped into one. The bees started swarming her and either her or Phil got mad and kicked one of the boxes over. My neighbor keeps a sensor perimeter around his bee boxes in case of bears, so that went off and he ran to his bee boxes to see two middle-aged people running around, swatting at bees and yelling. Neighbor called the sheriff, and after about 20 minutes of the neighbor trying to smoke the bees and hosing them off, promptly pressed charges for the destruction of his bee box and trespassing. Apparently there are additional charges for disrupting/destroying a farm's agricultural capability, and since his bees are pollinators for his orchard, away the two went. Both were apparently covered in stings and are in county lockup now. Sheriff said the professor is trying to say the area the bee boxes are in were a public easement and she had rightful access to the area. Now on to second story. Discovered my wife's 4-year affair by following her to the secret apartment she shared with her coworker, and publicly threw her belongings out. My wife, Leah, 43F, and I have been married for 10 years. We have 2 beautiful children, our 5-year-old son and our 2-year-old daughter. I thought we were happy, or at least, I thought we were trying. But 4 weeks ago, my entire life came crash down. I, 46 male, started to notice when she was glued to her phone more than usual. Leah has always been private, but this was different. She'd smile at her screen, then immediately lock it when I walked into the room. One night, after she fell asleep, I couldn't resist. I checked her phone. What I found still makes me sick to my stomach. There were messages with a coworker, Eric, 48M, going back years. Explicit texts. Photos. Promises of love. Even references to secret trips they'd taken while I was at home with the kids, believing she was working late. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. I confronted her the next morning. At first, she denied it, said I was misunderstanding. But when I read her the messages out loud, her face crumbled. She admitted it. She said it started 4 years ago, long before our youngest was born. She tried to justify it, you were distant, we were struggling. But nothing could excuse this. I started digging deeper. I followed her to work one day, needing to see it for myself. Sure enough, after her shift, she walked out arm in arm with Eric. They didn't even try to hide it. They got into his car and drove off. I followed them to a restaurant where they sat like a happy couple, laughing, holding hands. It broke me. But what shattered me completely was when I learned they'd built their own life together. They'd been renting an apartment near work, a place where she'd go when she was working overtime. I saw them go inside, watching them from my car parking on the streets, a few blocks away. I checked on them for about 4 nights, and they had the same routine. That's when I snapped. I packed all of her belongings, everything she owned, into the back of my car and drove to her workplace the next morning after spying on them. I know I did wrong. When she walked out, I dumped everything right there on the sidewalk in front of her and her coworkers. I told her she wasn't coming home. Since then, I've filed for divorce and am fighting for the full custody of the kids. She's begging me to forgive her, saying she doesn't want to lose the family we built. But how can I? Friends and family keep asking me if I regret how I handled it, publicly humiliating her, kicking her out without notice. I do. She tore our family apart, and the least she could do is face some accountability, but I can't help but feel like the bad guy for how I acted. I had nights where I felt very lonely, and I miss her. Of course, I am also attending to therapy sessions to be better for the kids and for myself. All I care about are them, they don't deserve this chaos. And as much as it hurts, I know they are better off with me than someone who could live a lie for so long. Am I the asshole? Update 1. For those asking how I didn't notice her affair for 4 years, it's because Leah was always incredibly private. She was adamant about boundaries and would shut me down if I asked too many questions. She handled the rent, utilities, and her own expenses, while I covered groceries, the kids' school costs, internet, water, and anything extra. She claimed it was fair since we both worked, and I didn't push because I trusted her and didn't want to create unnecessary conflict. Looking back, I can see how I missed the signs, but at the time, I didn't think questioning her was necessary. After finding out about her affair, I had DNA tests done for both kids. My son is biologically mine, but my daughter isn't. That was a tough pill to swallow, but it doesn't change anything for me. I've been her father in every way that matters, and I love her like my own. I believe the person who raises a child is their real parent, and no court is going to convince me otherwise. Right now, I'm in the middle of the legal process. The divorce itself hasn't been finalized yet, but I've made it clear that I'm fighting for full custody of both kids. I've explained to the court why I believe Leah isn't fit to have primary custody. Her betrayal wasn't just a personal one, it shows a complete disregard for the stability and well-being of our family. The court process is slow, and so far, we've only had preliminary hearings. I've provided evidence of her infidelity and the double life she led, and I've asked for a full psychological evaluation for both of us to ensure the best decision is made for the kids. I'm also working on showing the court that I've been the primary caregiver emotionally and financially. My lawyer has told me it's a tough battle, especially since courts often lean toward joint custody, but I'm not backing down. To those who said my story sounded fake, I get it. This is the kind of nightmare you think only happens in movies or to someone else. I wouldn't believe it either if I wasn't living it. All I can say is, I hope you never go through something like this. It destroys everything you thought you knew about your life. For now, I'm staying focused on my kids and doing everything I can to give them a stable and loving home. They're the only good thing to come out of all this, and I won't let them down. Thank you for your support. It means more than you know. Oop, I'm really sorry you had to go something like this twice. That's unimaginable. Thank you for your support and for sharing your experience. It helps to know I'm not alone in this. I do have screenshots of the entire conversation from her phone. Years of texts, photos, and everything else. I made sure to send them to myself before confronting her, so I have all the proof I need. Sometimes, I think about exposing her and him publicly, putting it all out there so people see what they did. But honestly, I'm just so drained. Between work, taking care of my kids, and trying to process everything, I barely have the energy to keep going some days, let alone drag them through the mud. And even when I do feel angry enough to do it, there's a part of me that feels guilty. I don't know why. I mean, they're the ones who destroyed everything, but I guess it's because I don't want to stoop to their level. I'm taking things one step at a time and focusing on what's most important, my kids and getting through this divorce. Maybe one day I'll feel differently, but for now, I just don't have it in me to make a spectacle out of their betrayal, even if they deserve it. I feel like I'm stupid for this mindset.